Dr. Cheney, Professor Johnson, Professor Dolan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm deeply honored to be invited as the speaker of the 52nd Shen Memorial Lecture 2013 and the 100 years of economics. Let me extend my heartiest congratulations to UWA for its centenary year and for a century of economics education at this esteemed institution. It is a great pleasure for me to be back here at the UWA, or Western Australia. It was here that I first learned good, sound economics that have been invaluable to me for the whole of my career. I believe that a good start does matter. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like also to pay special tribute to Edward Shen. I did some homework on this. Of course, as mentioned by Professor Clement, he was the foundation professor of history and economics, and later the inaugural professor of economics in this state. Professor Shen was a strong believer in the allocative efficiency of the market. He was also deeply interested in policy and in providing a historical context to economic development. Professor Shen's career provided a salutary lesson of the often fraught relations between economic rationality and politics, a theme that constantly recurs to the present day. Let me turn to the topic of my talk today. After having left academia for quite some time now, I do not feel qualified enough to talk about the latest topics at the frontier of economic science. Instead, I wish to do something less exacting. I would like to share with you a story about the problems that policymakers face in a developing country undergoing political transformation. That country is Indonesia, your next door neighbor, where I have been a practitioner with varying responsibilities for over 3 decades now. I hope this story will still be of interest to you, as it still falls within the broad view of economics in the Edward Shen tradition. I will couch my story within a simple framework. As I see it, there are essentially 4 basic elements in any economic policy. Economics and politics, which largely determine the substance of policy, and legal and bureaucratic processes, which underpin the policy's delivery and implementation. A policy in action is the product of the interactions between them. In reality, the interactions are often complex, involving twists and turns, and defy simple characterization. There is no guarantee that a policy will contain sensible ideas, undistorted by political processes along the way to its adoption, or that it will always be implemented faithfully and fully according to its original intent. There is never an ideal policy, and it is quite rare in real life that a policy is close enough to its ideal form. From the beginning of the process, when the policy is initially conceived as a set of ideas, biases of all kinds may enter. And when they go through the political processes, compromises may somehow erode or bend the original intent. When it comes to implementation on the ground, distortions and noises will inevitably also affect a policy. The practical goal of real-life policy making is therefore how to come up with a workable policy, one that could result in the achievement of, say, more than 50% of the original or rational goals with the minimum negative side effects. I know it sounds like too modest a goal, but in the context of developing countries, it often is the realistic goal that already demands considerable amount of time and energy to expand. Ladies and gentlemen, to set the stage, let me take you briefly to a period that marks an important turning point in our recent political economic history. For 3 decades until 1997, Indonesia was a quotable example of development success. Our economic growth per capita averaged around 5% per annum. Many human development indicators, including those for health, life expectancy, and education, had steadily improved. There was even talk during this period that Indonesia would become another miracle economy in Asia. But then, as is well known, in 1997-98, the Asian financial crisis hit countries in Asia, and Indonesia was the hardest hit. Growth turned sharply negative, minus 14% in 1998, and our debt to GDP ratio jumped from some comfortable levels to over 100% within a short period. Massive layoffs and sharply rising food and other basic necessities concomitantly occurred, triggering social unrest. What started as a financial crisis had subsequently developed into social and political crisis. Amid the rather chaotic situation, a process of political change was set in motion. Indonesians have prided themselves, I think with some justification, for having passed the crucial stage of democratic transition rather well. The situation in Indonesia in 1998 was actually quite fragile. The confluence of forces was such that doubts abounded, especially among foreign observers, about whether the country could survive the turmoil and remain in one piece. Yet within 17 months after the change of power, the basic elements of a democratic electoral system were in place. Within the next 3 years, the necessary constitutional and institutional reforms were largely completed. Since then, Indonesia has become a full-fledged democracy. I have had the great benefit and very interesting experience of being involved in policymaking in Indonesia in the 2 very different periods. During the first 15 years, my 15 years in government, I was involved in various policymaking roles during the period of the New Order, when President Suharto was the leading policymaker. I learned a lot from observing and subsequently actively participating in the process of policymaking. Then, under the leadership of the main economic architect of the New Order, Professor Widjojo Nitisastro. In the second 15 years, my second 15 years in government, except for about 2 years of break, I've been part of the governments of 3 presidents. I would like to describe to you how the 2 different political environments had influenced economic policies and more generally development policies in Indonesia. The comparison is relevant because, as I partly alluded to earlier, the New Order regime is known to be a successful regime in development achievement, but falls short in democratic accountability. While the present regime would glowingly pass all tests for a democracy, but something falls short in development achievement. This leads to some pertinent questions. Is it possible to combine the best of both worlds? What are the elements of policymaking in the new order that could be incorporated into the present system without harming democratic accountability? If there are, how should we do it? These are questions that I wish to explore in just a few minutes with you today. I will do this by comparing and contrasting policymaking in the two periods to find hints on which part of the present system possibly needs some reform. For about 2 decades, from the advent of the new order in 1966, the economic ideas of the technocrats, a solid group of mainstream economic professionals and bureaucrats, undisputedly dominated the economic policy scene. Our development strategy and policies were largely the product of that group. Bappenas, the National Development Planning Board, especially when Professor Wijoyo was for many years its chairman, was the nerve center of policymaking in Indonesia. But then, even after his official retirement in 1983, he continued to play a crucial role in coordinating economic policy. However, probably around the mid-1980s, new pressure groups began to emerge, often offering competing policy ideas. And as the years passed, they commanded growing influence and leverage over the president. The technocrats continued to play an important role throughout the New Order period, but toward the end of the period, their influence was clearly waning. While power remained securely in the hands of President Suharto, competitions for the president's ear grew increasingly more intense. That when the financial crisis of 1997-98 hit the country, that policy environment, and coupled with the unsound advices from the IMF, led to incoherent policy responses and confusing policy signals that eventually resulted in a devastated economy. Since then, Indonesia has not had a solid group of policymakers comparable to the New Order technocrats. There is now a wider spectrum of economic ideas in the market with differing levels of rationality and intellectual worthiness, competing for public support. This is, of course, what one expects of a democracy. Every important policy proposal has to be negotiated through. Policymaking has become more transparent, more publicly accountable, but also more challenging, more noisy, and more time-consuming. Our free media has facilitated public discourses on almost any subject, albeit with varying qualities. It is neither possible nor desirable, of course, in the name of efficient policymaking to re-establish the new order condition. But it does suggest that there may be one important element missing in the present setup that is crucial for the making of effective policies. That missing element is some kind of an anchor of rationality and common sense. In their days, the technocrats provided such an anchor, perhaps even also that of intellectual integrity. Despite the fact that the number of economists and other development professionals in the country is far greater now than it was during the New Order, such an anchor does not exist yet. My view is that we still need to build a critical mass of economists and other professionals who possess intellectual integrity and sense of public service to raise the quality of policy discourses. And this cannot simply be left to the slow, natural process. This would be too long and too risky, in my view, for the fate of the democratic experiment. The critical mass has to be systematically built, starting from the very core of policymaking, that is the cabinet and the bureaucracy, and then moving outward to the legislatures and finally to the public at large. Well-planned training and upgrading programs for those directly involved, and high-quality public education for those who are indirectly involved are the answer. They must be made an integral part of the bureaucratic reform and education policy. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now turn to another factor in the realm of politics that has changed the policy-making environment. In the New Order era, power was concentrated in the hands of the president. Political change of command worked effectively to minimize distortions and noises. The advent of democracy has changed all that. Political centers of power have become more dispersed. Consultations, lobbying, and compromises replaced commands. Parliamentary discussions have become much more assertive and vigorous. Ministers now need to spend many, many hours in parliamentary commissions. And the media and public commentaries have become much more dominant. There are some who argue that while the New Order president was all too powerful, the presidents under the present democracy have a latitude of power falling short of what the latter need to function effectively in a presidential system. And since the policy areas requiring approval from the parliament are very wide, a president who does not command a majority in the parliament, which is the case in Indonesia for, I think, the foreseeable future, will have to form a coalition cabinet with all its potential shortcomings. Let me add yet another complication. With one president in the helm throughout the New Order period, it was easier to set long-term goals and to maintain the consistency across cabinets. That has not changed also. Every 5 years, every presidential candidate is eager to differentiate himself and herself from the other candidates through their respective platforms and programs. Long-term programs encompassing several cabinet terms, such as building or reforming institutions, key to any development process, are not easy to hammer out. And once they are agreed, there is no reliable institution or mechanism to guarantee the consistency of the implementation across the terms of cabinet. In fact, I've come to believe that in any democracy, there is an inherent bias toward short-term issues and quick results. It is particularly difficult to come to agreement when policy involves trade-offs between short-term pains for long-term gains. And I must say that in Indonesia, short-termism is definitely stronger now than before. A variation of complication comes from our approach to decentralization. In 1999, we introduced the regional autonomy law, setting Indonesia on a big bang devolution of power from the central to the regional governments. A number of fresh initiatives and good outcomes have turned out since. But so have excesses, as partly indicated by the large number of corruption cases uncovered in the region. Additionally, the fact that we are now very much more decentralized and administratively and fiscally makes it harder to agree on issues involving trade-off between local versus national goals. At least for some areas of government, some people have argued that the pendulum has swung a little too far in one direction. So what needs to be done? What needs to be done? First, I think the weaknesses of our hybrid presidential system, one way or another, need to be addressed. A discourse is now ongoing where there's some rebalancing of power between the president and the parliament in favor of the former is what is required. And unlike in many presidential systems, an Indonesian president does not have a veto power. There is a more crystallized debate on the need to consolidate the number of political parties. What is needed is fewer parties and better quality representatives in parliament. We also urgently need clearer and more vigorously enforced rules on the financing of political parties. The balance of power between the capital, the provinces, and the district should be recalibrated. Rules must be tightened to eliminate fiscal and other excesses at all three levels of government, while preserving ample room for local creativity and innovation. These are all reforms to improve political governance, part of the greater agenda to consolidate our democracy. All have direct implications on the quality of policy making. But I must mention one important legacy of the new order, a good one, that has survived to the present and continues to be widely accepted and strongly supported by political parties today. It is the observance of prudent fiscal policy, the hallmark of the technocrats' macroeconomic management. A large fiscal deficit is equated with a larger national debt, a state of affairs that virtually all in the political spectrum today abhor. Some say that this fiscal conservatism has become our policy culture, a collective psyche not dissimilar with the attitude of the Germans toward their public finance management. And in this uncertain world, fiscal prudence is, I think, a good policy anchor. Ladies and gentlemen, all these complications in policymaking in a democratic setting are, of course, not an argument for returning to an authoritarian system. But if we want the present democracy to work and to thrive, we must address this problem seriously. We must embark on purposeful and systematic efforts to consolidate our democracy, to raise the quality of our democracy. There must be collective national efforts that transcend short-term and partisan views toward this end. And I do not think it is wise to take a more sanguine view that simply by continuing current practices, our democracy will eventually mature and the problems of balancing democratic accountability with technocratic efficiency of policymaking will resolve itself. That would be a risky strategy. My view is that it is imperative to maintain a minimum level of technocratic efficiency of policy making at all time and gradually upgrading it if a democracy is not to lose its legitimacy due to its failure to deliver the expected dividend. This risk is not imaginary at all. There are cases in modern world history of democratic failure that led to the rise of authoritarian regimes. In the 1950s, Indonesia already experienced such a case. In 1950, the young Indonesian Republic adopted a parliamentary democracy which effectively lasted only for 7 years. The regime was marked by fractious politics and political instability due to the rapid rise and fall of the cabinets, which in turn worsened the already poor economic conditions and triggered regional rebellions. Indonesia's first democratic experiment failed ignominiously, paving the way for 4 decades of authoritarian rule. Indonesia today must not repeat the same mistake. To be successful, efforts to improve political governance has to be accompanied by another major undertaking, namely to reform the legal system. Let me mention just a few things about this reform to give you some sense of the magnitude and the dimension of the task. Part of the challenge that we face is the need for reform the existing laws and regulations. Many of our laws are based on legislations drawn up in the Dutch pre-independence era and are now badly in need of revision. This task alone involves massive work of complicated redrafting of numerous laws, not to mention the redrafting of thousands of implementing regulations that are needed at different levels of government. Compounding this problem for various reasons that I alluded to earlier is the fact that the process of revising laws and passing new laws is often very time-consuming. But much more than improvements to laws and regulation alone are needed. At present, complaints abound about the way laws and regulations are implemented on the ground. Concrete responses to these complaints would raise public trust. What we need are more judges, attorneys, lawyers, and police investigators with high integrity, professionalism, and sense of public service. Better equipped courts and a stronger national police force equipped with all the necessary modern facilities. Again, we need purposeful long-term plans here. Some of the required action have in fact been started. One of them is the anti-corruption drive. Eradicating corruption is now at the very top of our national agenda. Opinion surveys have consistently shown that corruption have been viewed by the public as the #1 enemy of society. Since 2002, no less than 360 persons, ranging from parliament members, police officials, bureaucrats, bankers, governors, judges, mayors, and businessmen have been put in jail by the Corruption Eradication Commission, KPK, with many more high-profile scandals are still being investigated. This anti-corruption activism has had some impact. My sense is that now an anti-corruption mindset is beginning to spread steadily across the public institution. But such progress has to be truly institutionalized to have a lasting effect. Here, the reform of the bureaucracy, which I will presently discuss, is key. The bureaucracy is the principal player in the realm of policy implementation. Improvements in policy making require reforms in this machinery of government. On this issue, let me underscore a very basic principle for an effective bureaucracy in any democracy, that the bureaucracy must always serve the public interest. It must be free from factional politics and business interests that often try to exert pressures on officials. This basic principle is especially important for developing countries where malleable rules and low salaries coexist, and the risks of bureaucratic co-optation are great. The economist William Easterly, in his book, The White Man's Burden, blamed bureaucracy as the reason behind the ineffectiveness of foreign aid in assisting the developing countries by arguing that the rich have markets, the poor have bureaucrats. Developing countries are characterized, among many, by the significant prevalence of market failures, which led to calls for government intervention. Yet, one of the endemic problems faced by developing countries is corruption by public officials. Systemic corruption in the bureaucracy deters people with talents and integrity from entering, and thus further reduces the ability of the bureaucracy to perform effectively. So the poor in developing countries is often trapped in inconvenient choices between market failures versus corruption or market failures versus bad services. I agree with Easterly's view. An overhaul of our bureaucracy is vital for the continuation of our progress in the coming years. It is a medium-term to long-term endeavor. In fact, it must be a continuing one, as the government bureaucracy needs to continually reinvent itself in line with the society's ever-exacting demand. Ladies and gentlemen, the present government has drawn up a blueprint for the reform of the bureaucracy covering up to 2025. Many of the reform's goals are medium-term ones, but there are a number of actions that have already been undertaken. An important initiative that I wish to mention here is the launching of a computerized recruitment system, which has enhanced transparency, improved the quality of the recruits, and also saved money. We have also taken actions to improve the ease of doing business, some of them being initiatives taken by regional governments. And currently, there are two important bills being discussed in Parliament related to bureaucratic reforms. Ladies and gentlemen, I have now come to the last, but extremely important issue that deserves remark, namely education. Here lies the golden key to the improvements in all aspects of national life, including the quality of economic and development policies, namely the quality of human resources. And here, there is also a great task to do. A 2010 World Bank survey revealed that the skills of Indonesian secondary leavers do not match the expectation of employers due to their inadequate generic skills, such as in thinking and in behavior. Another survey by Statistics Indonesia shows that the enrollment rate is lower and the dropout rate is higher for students from poor families. Both surveys call for reforms in our education system, focusing on improving quality of and access to education. We take the reform in education system very seriously. We earmark 20% of government budget for education. And by 2013, a number of policies have been taken, ranging from improving teachers' salaries and implementing teacher certification program, to introducing new school curricula, providing subsidies for all registered schools in the country, and greatly increasing the number of scholarships for poor students at all levels of education. And the geography of our country has also prompted us to consider the expanded application of online learning system. Thus, the education sector has plenty of rooms for new initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude my talk with three general observations. First, policymaking in developing countries with a young democracy faces many challenges. Indonesia's experience underscores the critical importance of the environment for policymaking in influencing the quality of policies. Elements for making policy environment more conducive to high-quality policies include the building of anchors of rationality and common sense across institutions, as well as improvements in the standards of governance of political, legal, and bureaucratic institutions. Second, while the practice of democracy itself might eventually raise the standards of governance through better transparency of process and the operations of checks and balances, it may be much too long and too risky to rely on such natural process. The process could and should be synchronized and accelerated through the implementation of purposeful and systematic plans to improve governance in all relevant institutions. And third, there is a grand theme that runs through many parts of my story. That is, that there is a basic dilemma with policymaking under democracy, and unresolved since the time of Plato. The dilemma is the difficulty of finding a balance between rationalism and populism in the formulation of policy, between an effective government and a representative government, and between technocracy and democracy. There is no single model appropriate for all countries and for all time. At every stage of its development, each nation has to find its own right or workable balance between those competing goals. Thank you for listening.